Thanks, Jake. Another minute or two, and then we'll start the presentation.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, we're almost at the 2-minute mark, so I think now's a good enough time as any to start. So welcome, everyone. My name's Anthony Bigelow. I'm convener for the Victorian Environment Friends Network. I would like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm connecting in from today, which is the lands of the Wurundjeri, and pay respects to elders past and present, and that lands were never ceded. We are welcoming Jake Robinson tonight to do what is bound to be another enthralling and exciting presentation. Jake did one earlier in the year, so for everyone who's come along again, welcome. For newcomers, welcome also. Jake's background is a microbial and restoration ecologist at Flinders University and is the author of Invisible Friends and Tree Wilding. His latest book, The Nature of Pandemics, explores how ecological disruption drives disease and how restoring nature helps protect both the planet and ourselves. So please welcome me in joining Dr. Jake Robinson to the presentation. Thank you, Jake.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just to let everyone know that we're probably going to have to jump off after half an hour or so and then rejoin, just because the Zoom will kick us off otherwise. So yeah, without further ado, so my name's Jake Robinson, and I'm a microbial and restoration ecologist. I've studied various different things, so ecology, ecosystem health, social research, applied neuroscience, and have a PhD in microbial ecology. And that is to say that my work is very interdisciplinary. I'm currently based at Flinders, and you can find more out about me at these links at the bottom. I'd like to pay my respects to the Ghana people where I'm presenting this presentation in Adelaide, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Okay, so I'm just going to start off, just going to minimize that. Start off with a little personal anecdote. So my new book's all about pandemics, but really it's about One Health and how our health and the health of the environment's all interconnected. But this is a place I used to live in back in the UK called Eam. When we first moved there, we called it Eam, and then swiftly got told off by the locals. It's Eam. Anyway, it's a nice little place, little village in the Peak District in England. Our house was somewhere around there. And it has a really fascinating story relating to the bubonic plague back in the 1600s, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. So this is just outside of Eam on the edge of the village, and you can see there's some moorlands in the background and fairly normal looking kind of sheep pasture there, and a fairly normal looking rock in the foreground. And the rock's the thing we need to focus on. So if we flip it on its side, you'll see something unusual about this rock. So let's flip it on its side. As you can see there, something a little strange. And if you're a little odd like me, you might be thinking, wow, look at all those lichens. What a diverse assemblage of symbiotic organisms. Or if you're more normal, you're probably thinking, what the heck are those holes? And that's what we're going to talk about in a moment. There's a bit of a close-up view of the holes on the rocks there. And these little holes in the rocks played actually a key part in preventing the spread of a disease outbreak back in the 1600s. And these rocks are kind of dotted around the edges of villages. They're called parish stones. So in the olden days, they essentially used these stones to mark the boundaries of the parishes. Now, back in Eyam in the 1665, there was an outbreak of bubonic plague, and it all started with this guy, George Vickers, who was the village tailor. So he made the clothes for all the villagers. And he ordered some cloth from London to be delivered, and it was brought up probably by horse and cart, I'm guessing, and it got really wet on the way. It's very damp in the UK always, nearly. Anyway, this cloth got really wet on the way, and George Vickers received the cloth and noticed it was damp, and then unfilled it to dry it out. Unwittingly, George Vickers released a load of fleas from this damp cloth, and unfortunately, a few days later, George Vickers was dead. Very sad. So this flea, so the disease, the bubonic plague, is caused by this bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It's a rod-shaped bacterium, and it requires a vector, and that vector is the flea that carries it around. There's a flea. And it has quite an interesting ecology, a co-evolutionary ecology with the flea, this bacterium. So the bacterium's co-evolved with the flea. It's evolved strategies in order to increase the likelihood that it can pass its progeny on to future hosts. And so what it does is it's evolved this ability to form biofilms, this kind of sticky matrix in the flea's midgut. And it basically clogs the flea's system up, and the flea becomes starved. It's basically starves, and then it's feeding on the host. So it bites a little host on the skin to receive a blood meal, and it repeatedly does this. But because the blood can't get to the gut, and because of this biofilm that the bacterium's created, then it essentially regurgitates the blood. And by regurgitating the blood, sorry, this is all very disgusting, apologize in advance, although I've already gone there now, so it's not much use apologizing now. So basically the flea regurgitates the blood and passes on the bacterium to the host. And now the flea often requires an intermediate host, and this is sometimes the rat, quite famous for carrying around fleas. Now, back in the 1600s, we didn't really have any knowledge of microorganisms. It was only 15, 20 years later until the Dutch microscopist famously so-called discovered microorganisms. But back in those days, in the 1660s, we didn't know what microorganisms were. And so we thought the causative agent of diseases was something called a miasma, or this kind of evil spirit floating around in the air. Or sometimes they called it plague seeds. So these kind of seeds floating around in the air. Now, just down the valley from this little village called Eyam was another village called Stony Middleton, and I used to live there as well. And then just over the hills, there was a town back then called Sheffield. Now it's a city, famous for making steel. And so these hamlets and towns and villages, etc., these were all at risk from the bubonic plague, from spreading from that outbreak in Eyam. Now, the Eyam villagers did something really heroic, and it's quite famous, this little village in Derbyshire, for what they did back then. So they had a huge outbreak of this bubonic plague, and they all got together and decided to quarantine the entire village. So this is one of the earliest forms of, I guess, social distancing due to a disease. So the whole village quarantined itself. It's quite weird because as I was writing parts for this book and thinking about content, I was actually living in in Eyam, which is famous for quarantining itself, and that was during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we were kind of quarantining ourselves in a village that was famous for quarantining itself. Anyway, very strange. Okay, so back to those holes on the rock. So you're probably thinking, come on, you've mentioned those holes. What are they? Well, these are really important holes, and they actually use these holes to prevent the spread of diseases. And so because they quarantined themselves in the village, they needed food and other supplies in order to sustain themselves. And so what they did is they had an agreement with the local villages who brought them food, left them at the boundaries and the boundary stones, and in return, the Eam villagers placed coins in these holes, and then they filled the holes with vinegar. So they knew the vinegar actually destroyed the pathogen. They didn't know it was a pathogen, but they knew it kind of prevented the spread of diseases. And so what you'd have is these little stones around the village with these holes filled with vinegar and coins in exchange for bread and vegetables, etc. And actually, this helped prevent the spread of the bubonic plague to those surrounding villages. Now, the village today, if you go there, have lots of these commemorative plaques dotted around the village to commemorate the kind of bravery that the Eam villagers displayed back in those harrowing times. And you'll see here that there's very sad plaques to look at and read. So you see the one in the middle, 9 members of the Thorpe family lived here. They all died. So obviously very depressing to read this kind of stuff, but there are lots of these plaques there now commemorating these people for their bravery. Now, something even stranger than this, we used to have these strange ceremonies, or I'm not sure what you'd call it. Anyway, it's a kind of an annual event around bonfire night. So back in the UK, we put this Guy Fawkes on top of a bonfire. I don't think you do that over here. I'm not sure. Anyway, back in Eam, they created this huge artificial rat and carried it through the village, and we'd walk through the village and with these fiery torches in our hands, literally with flames, and we'd shout this really strange thing. We'd shout, "Burn the rat! Burn the rat! Burn the rat!" Very odd, as I said, but that's one of those traditions that happens in these tiny Peak District villages. It's quite interesting, but it's just a reflection of our perception of rats as these kind of disease-causing creatures. Now, we need to talk about rats. Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. So research suggests that rats might not have been the leading carriers of the fleas and lice that caused the Black Death. And the culprits? That large, wonderless-filled, hairy and promiscuous mammal, Homo sapiens. So back then, we carried lots of parasites, these things called ectoparasites. They live in our hair and our skin. And they often included things like lice and fleas. And we actually still carry parasites on us now. So everybody watching this, you might want to plug your ears and probably cover your eyes for the next slide if you don't want to see something disgusting. But essentially, we still carry these kind of parasites in our skin now. So everybody watching this has these fellas living in their face. So we actually have a face full of animals, these tiny animals. They're arachnids, so they're mites called Demodex mites. Everyone sat here now watching this has around 1,000 to 2,000 of these in your skin right now. Horrible, isn't it? Up to 20,000 if you've got skin conditions. So this is to say that we still carry parasites, and if you see my other talk, and I'll probably talk at the end as well, about the microbes that we carry in our bodies, trillions of them, but many of them are playing really important roles in maintaining our health and survival. So we're this kind of walking, talking ecosystem. But back then, in the 1600s, we used to carry fleas and lice as well. Now, there's a study here published a few years ago, 2018, human ectoparasites and the spread of the plague in Europe during the second pandemic. And their results essentially support that the idea that human ectoparasites were the primary vectors for plague. So we kind of historically blame these other animals for carrying the plague diseasing agents around and spreading disease, etc. But actually, it's more likely that we were just spreading it between ourselves through those ectoparasites that we were carrying ourselves. So it's pretty interesting, isn't it? And we spread it across Asia and Europe through what's called the Silk Road. Some of you have probably heard of that. It's this huge trade network that basically connects all these countries up. And so we were traveling across this huge trade network, talking to each other, and spreading the disease, mingling with each other. Now, the significance of this the significance of this lies in highlighting the human tendency to blame blame others, whether it's bats, rats, pigeons, or pangolins. And so this little snippet is taken from the book, The Nature of Pandemics. Now, social norms and cognitive mirages of rightness can drive the notion of blame, yet pointing the finger at wildlife for pandemics is off track. It's a misguided heuristic that overlooks the complexity of diseases, ecosystems, and human antics. But importantly, it's also a way to keep solutions buried in a grave of misconception. So we have this tendency of assigning blame to others, whether it's other people or whether it's other animals for diseases, etc. But by doing this, you're not seeing the woods for the trees. We're missing the point, the root cause of the issues, and by doing that, we're not actually generating solutions that tackle the actual issue. Okay, so what is a pandemic? The worldwide spread of an infectious disease that affects a large number of people across multiple countries and continents. But if you're into etymology, like I am, so kind of understanding the roots of words, you'd be quite interested in this. So what does love have to do with it? Well, in the 5th century BCE, Plato, so this is when pandemic was first used, he used the term pandemic to describe popular or pandemic love instead of heavenly love. So actually the word pandemic was first used to describe love of all the people. So pan meaning all and demic or demos meaning people. Pretty interesting snippet there. So there's been lots of outbreaks and plagues across the years. Before a couple of thousand years ago, a few thousand years ago, there weren't pandemics just simply because they are crowd infections. And so, we weren't living in crowds until a couple of thousand years ago, 4,000 years ago, whatever. So we didn't really have pandemics at one point. So uttering the word, when is the next pandemic going to happen, simply wouldn't have entered anybody's mind. But there obviously have been some huge pandemics and huge plagues throughout history. So the Justinian plague and the bubonic plague or the Black Death. So these have been responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths and potentially up to 50% of the world's population at the time. So shocking stuff. Then the smallpox, that's quite a big one as well. And there's this disease called Cockalitzli. This is where we think the Europeans basically brought over some disease agents to Mexico and the Central and South America. And unfortunately, lots of indigenous people died, 17 million, in fact. And more recent research actually thinks it might have been salmonella, strangely. I was very surprised at that, but yeah, interesting stuff. And then more recently, we've had more kind of flu-like diseases or outbreaks. And this is for various reasons, various ecological reasons, and also agricultural reasons, and all sorts of other reasons that give rise to things like bird flu. And then we've obviously lived through a horrible pandemic in the last few years, COVID-19. 7.1 million was the official kind of last estimate, but it might be up to 15 million. And then disease X is actually a WHO organization term. It's a placeholder term for the next pandemic. We know it's coming, but we don't know what it is yet. And so COVID-19 6 years ago would have been known as disease X. And really interestingly, so zoonotic diseases, so these are diseases that spread from non-human animals into humans. These outbreaks and pandemics are increasing in frequency and diversity. So this is the really important point. So these kind of horrible events are happening more frequently and they are more diverse. And there's various reasons for this, and most of them are human-driven. So we have habitat destruction, the illegal wildlife trade, climate change, agricultural intensification, chemical pollution, and urbanization/globalization. Now, habitat destruction drives this frequency and diversity of diseases in various ways. Two of the key ones are it puts us into closer contact with disease vectors that would ordinarily be kind of locked up in the wild. So we're encroaching onto wild habitats, and then it obviously provides the conditions for disease agents to jump into our bodies. Another reason habitat destruction is a key driver is because it stresses the disease vectors out. So the hosts that harbor some of the diseases, for instance, some bats, when we destroy their habitat, we stress them out. When we stress them out because they can't find food and obviously their habitat's gone, then this weakens their immune system. And when their immune system is weakened, they're more likely to shed viral particles into the environment. So it has this kind of dual effect. Climate change is increasing the range at which certain pathogens can survive. So Lyme disease, for instance, the pathogen and the ticks are actually able to survive far more north than they used to. And this affects 500,000 people a year in the US. Crazy numbers. The illegal wildlife trade. So this is quite self-explanatory. Wildlife, wild animals should be in the wild, not be kept as pets and transported around the world and cooked up in hot pots and medicines and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of self-explanatory. Agricultural intensification. So we're cramming animals in closed, confined spaces. This provides the perfect kind of hotbed conditions for pathogens to jump and swap genes through horizontal gene transfer and various other factors. Chemical pollution, I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And then urbanization and globalization. So again, we ourselves are the disease vectors. We're carrying diseases around the world and increasing their distribution. So lots of these factors driving the frequency and diversity of disease outbreaks. And this is obviously something that we need to pay much more attention to, particularly if we want to solve the issue. And so just to let you know, we're going to be kicked off in, it looks like 7 minutes or so. But then if you just jump back on the link that you logged on here in the first place, then we can pick the talk up from there. I probably have enough time to talk through this next story. So what have vultures got to do with it? So there's a whole chapter devoted to vultures in the book. These are one of my favorite birds of prey. They're often seen as omens, bad omens, and viewed in a negative light. And I guess they're kind of, images of vultures with their beaks adorned with offal and ragged sinews, probably not as charismatic as a panda doing roly-polies or whatever, but they play really important roles in the ecosystem. So they are essentially the cleaners of ecosystems. So vultures feed on carcasses, and their guts are essentially a dead end for pathogens. So when certain pathogens enter the vultures, their life cycle ends in the vultures. So they prevent disease outbreaks. Now in India, back in the 1980s, the vulture population was enormous. So in the 1980s, there were 40 million vultures flying around, and that was more than the human population of Spain at the time. By the 1990s, so 15 years later, the vulture population had declined from 40 million by 95%. So one of the fastest declines of any kind of organism on Earth, really, I think. And again, this isn't talked about very much either. So 95% decline in the vulture population. And from a disease perspective, this was majorly significant. So as I mentioned, they clean up all the carcasses that usually lie around the landscape and prevent diseases from spreading. But what had happened is that farmers were putting down, they were inoculating cows with a chemical called diclofenac, and this some of you may have heard of. It's anti-inflammatory, so humans also use it to control inflammation. Oh, this meeting has been upgraded. Okay, excellent. So they were giving their cows diclofenac to prevent lameness, so basically to prolong the cow's life as they're wandering around the landscape. Now, as the cows were dying, just naturally of natural causes, they would obviously die, and the diclofenac would be still in their bodies. Now, the vultures would feed on the cows, and they'd uptake the diclofenac. But diclofenac is extremely toxic to vultures, so just a tiny amount can wipe out huge numbers of vultures. So it was a very sad occurrence that happened in the 1980s and 90s to vulture populations. And I interviewed a really interesting man from India. He was a conservationist that first noticed this decline, and he was a very funny man as well. So he actually asked the villagers what they thought had been happening to the vultures, where the vultures been going, and he said the most common response by the villagers was, "The Americans are vacuuming them out of the sky," which he was absolutely in tears as he was with laughter as he was explaining this story to me. So that's fascinating stuff. But there's actually a really sad story. Obviously, they weren't being vacuumed out of the cloud. They were out of the sky. They were being inadvertently poisoned. And the reason nobody was seeing them, so they weren't seeing any dead vultures around on the floor, is because the vultures would return to their treetop nests and they just simply die in their nests. So incredibly sad, makes me feel emotional. But essentially, Vibhu would do some treetop surveys and he would notice all these dead vultures in the treetops. So that's why nobody was seeing them. Importantly, from a disease perspective, the huge numbers of cows' bodies and various other carcasses were increasing across the landscape because there weren't vultures there to clean them up. And this led to an increase, a boom in the feral dog population in India. The feral dogs were eating all of these carcasses, and they were rearing their pups in the carcasses as well for protection. And they were picking up the rabies virus. And essentially, dog bites increased throughout India during this period, and thousands of people died of rabies. And it cost the economy billions and billions of dollars. This was all because we put a little chemical in a cow, and obviously, ended up wiping the vulture population out. This is just to say that a single species can be extremely important in disease dynamics terms. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about a little complex topic, I suppose, now, but I'll try and explain it in really simple terms, hopefully. So this is the dilution effect. So when we've got thriving ecosystems, functional thriving ecosystems that we look after, we often have a relatively high diversity of different species in these ecosystems. And there's a concept in disease ecology called, they refer to hosts as competent or incompetent. And the competence refers to the ability of the animal to support pathogens. So if it's a highly competent host, the environment inside the animal's body is very friendly to pathogens. Whereas if it's an incompetent host, the animal's immune system basically kicks out the pathogens and says, there's no room for you to live in my body. Okay, so that's really key to remember, the kind of competency. Now, in a thriving ecosystem with lots of different species, there are often fewer competent hosts. So as illustrated on the screen here, there might be just this wood mouse here. So this is the only host that's really competent at supporting a pathogen. When we degrade ecosystems, so when we destroy ecosystems and reduce the species diversity in these ecosystems, what happens is the relative abundance of competent hosts, so these particular animals that can support pathogens, tends to increase, as you can see here. So now there are lots of these wood mice in this degraded and damaged ecosystem. From a disease perspective, this is really important. So this is in relation to Lyme disease. Now, Lyme disease is transmitted by ticks. And as you can see here, in a thriving ecosystem, there's lots of species. There's a low relative abundance of competent hosts. You might have 5 ticks. Obviously, there's going to be thousands, but just take 5, for example. And in this example, there might be one of those ticks that carries the Borrelia burgdorferi bacterium that causes Lyme disease. And so there's a relatively low infection risk to humans. However, when we degrade ecosystems, the abundance of competent hosts goes up. And then say you have the same number of ticks, so they're 5, what you tend to find is 4 out of the 5 of these ticks might carry the Borrelia burgdorferi bacterium, because there are more hosts for them to support the ticks. And then what you have in this case is the infection risk to humans increases. So this is all because we're kind of degrading and fragmenting ecosystems. So I hope you all get that. I hope I explained that okay. And this is explained much better in the book. Now, the first part of the book is all about kind of flipping the narrative about wildlife being to blame for pandemics and causing diseases on its head. And it also talks about some of those disease dynamics, which I explained. The second part of the book is focused on which pathogen will cause the next pandemic in humans. This is a really interesting section to write. So there are five chapters. The first one is Disease X. So this is all about that it's coming. We don't know what it is. But as I say, COVID-19 was once Disease X. So that was a really fascinating chapter to write. The next chapter is all about viruses. So I talk about all kinds of different viruses, including influenza, which is a really important one at the moment. Can we escape this bacterial blitzkrieg? That's chapter 7. So this is talking about the potential of bacteria to cause the pandemic, and really talking about exploring the idea of antimicrobial resistance, and how we could potentially view this as a form of a pandemic in itself. The next chapter is called A Fungal Frenzy. Could this be The Last of Us? So that's a play on words of the HBO series that's out at the moment. It's, if you haven't seen it, it's basically a zombie type series where a cordyceps fungus, because of climate change, has evolved to survive in the human body, the warm conditions of the human body, and then essentially takes over the human brain and turns the humans into zombies, and they start eating each other. Very horrible stuff. So that's kind of based on that idea. Could this potentially happen in humans? Could a fungal disease turn us into zombies? And then there's protozoan peril. So should we eradicate mosquitoes? That was a really interesting one to write. I talk about the kind of the ethics and the practicalities of potentially eradicating certain mosquito species to prevent things like malaria. Talking of malaria, if you think you are too small to make a difference, try spending the night in a closed room with a mosquito. So this, I think it's an African proverb. It's often misquoted. It's actually supposed to be a kind of quite an inspiring line to see. If you think you're too small, then try spending a night with a mosquito. But actually, try spending a night with the protozoan that the mosquito carries. It should be the real risk, really. So protozoans are tiny. They are 500 times smaller in length and 100 million times smaller in volume than a mosquito. But obviously they cause horrible diseases. Now, I'm just going to run through a few statistics on diseases. So these are kind of annual deaths. So this is all morbid. I apologize for that, but it's really important to understand these facts so that we can start thinking about solutions. So malaria causes 600,000 deaths annually, approximately. AIDS or AIDS-related diseases cause 630,000 annually in the world. Flus cause around 470,000 deaths globally every year, and this fluctuates quite a bit season by season. TB, this is a big one. So TB is 1.2 million people die every year of tuberculosis. It's caused by the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacterium. So that's a huge one. And then measles is 140,000. And again, this fluctuates quite a lot year upon year. So we have our 5 big diseases here. Now I'm just going to show you what fungi, how many people die from fungi. So fungi, many people think of fungi as the mushrooms you eat or you see in forests, etc. But many, if not most species of fungi are actually microscopic. And it's these microscopic fungi that live in the environment that can cause various human diseases that we don't talk about very often. So fungi kill around 3.8 million people every year globally. Just let that sink in for a moment, because that is not spoken about enough. And that's a huge number of people that die due to fungal diseases. Now, I'll just give you a second to look at this and think about what this refers to. So the left bar, 98.5%, refers to viruses, bacteria, protozoa, so some of the main disease-causing agents. And then 1.5% refers to fungi. So if you want to have a think about what that might refer to, and then I'll put the answer up now. So less than 1.5% of all infectious disease research funding is directed to fungi, despite the fact that they are responsible for 3.8 million deaths. Now, a lot of these deaths are secondary infections. So, for instance, you might have pneumonia or various other diseases that weakens your immune system, and then fungi basically come and end your life, unfortunately. So now The Last of Us. This is, sorry, I should have put a trigger warning up there. Oop, oh God, what's just happened? Okay, trigger warning, horrible fungi, zombie person coming up. Okay, there we go. So this is the HBO series of The Last of Us. As I mentioned, this cordyceps fungus. It's got a good message about climate change, actually, because climate change has increased the temperatures across the world, which has allowed this cordyceps fungus to evolve to be more tolerant of warmer conditions. Therefore, it can colonize the human body and take over the body. Sometimes I read a section of the book out. I have been doing, but I'll probably skip over that today. But there's a whole chapter on this. The first 2 pages of this chapter is actually fictional, so it was quite a fun piece to write. And then obviously I get back to the popular science afterwards. But global deaths from fungi, in all seriousness, have doubled in a decade. So part of this is due to us being able to detect and diagnose these fungal diseases better. But other reasons are things like chemotherapies are increasing, and this reduces this weakens the immune system. And again, these are kind of secondary diseases often that come into your body after your immune system has been weakened. And there are various other ecological reasons as well. So 3.8 million deaths. So yeah, just something to talk about. And I think spread the word, spread awareness, because we do need more research funding in this area and people to talk about it more. Okay, so what about the zombie part? How real is that? And you'll find out in the book what's the actual case, how likely it is to happen to humans. But this is another trigger warning. The next slide is a bit yucky as well. But it's a real slide. It's a real image from nature. So this cordyceps fungus is actually infecting things in nature right now. And this is the carpenter ant, I think in the Amazon rainforest. So that's pretty disgusting, isn't it? So cordyceps fungi hijack an ant's nervous system and chemically rewire its behavior to climb and bite onto a leaf before the fungus erupts out of its brain, out of its head, and spreads its spores across the forest. So what actually happens is the fungus pumps out certain chemicals that control the ant's brain once it's colonized its body. And they control what's called gravitaxis and phototaxis. And gravity refers to gravity, taxis refers to movement, and photo refers to light. So it controls the ant's kind of machinery that allows it to move in response to light and gravity. And it basically causes the ant to climb up a tree. That's the gravity part, towards the light. That's the light part. Then once it reaches a certain height, it essentially bites down onto a leaf, which is known in the scientific world as the death grip. So essentially, the fungus's mycelium fills the mandibular area of the ant and causes the ant's mouth to close on a leaf, securing it in place. And then once it's secure on this leaf at the right kind of height, the fungus erupts out of the ant's body, and it's at the perfect height for the spores to float around the forest and continue the cycle. So this kind of stuff is already kind of happening in nature as we speak. The likelihoods of it happening in humans, I discuss in the book. Okay, so that second part of the book's all about what could be what could cause the next pandemic in terms of pathogens. The third part of the book is when will the next pandemic happen? And again, this is moving away from that human-centric kind of narrative. I think we've discussed that quite a lot in general. For wildlife, the next pandemic is already here. So this whole part of the book is focused on wildlife, and all the diseases that are happening in wildlife right now that are not reported in the news, or we don't really talk about it much. And, we hear about bird flu every now and then, but there's so many other things going on in wildlife. And again, they're increasing in diversity and frequency. And so millions and millions of animals and all sorts of things are dying across the world. And we're driving that issue from ecosystem degradation, etc., climate change. This is a really sad story. The first time I read this, I kind of got a little emotional, so I'll try not to today. But Ring a Roses and bats with white noses. So this is all about bats. And this particular case in North America. So in 2006, there were these cavers doing their thing. So they're out climbing inside caves. And they noticed some bats on the cave wall, and they had a white frosting on their nose, as that illustrates there in the photograph. And they took a photo of these bats. They thought, oh, that's unusual, and they didn't really think much of it. They saved the photo on their hard drive or whatever. And then in 2007, so a year later, wildlife biologists were doing surveys of bats across the caves in New York State. And sadly, they found 10,000 bats dead on the floors of these caves. And it was caused by a fungus. So again, another fungus. This is known as the white nose syndrome fungus. And so this triggered, so there's a new story then released, thousands of bats are dying across the state. We're not sure why, but we know that they've got white noses. And then this triggered the memory, reminded these cavers that they took a photo of the bats. And so they sent the photograph into the officials. And that photograph was actually the first record of white nose syndrome in North America. So back in 2006. And as you can see from this UV image there on the right, the fungus also causes lesions in the wings of the bats. Now, the cross on this image indicates the epicenter of that outbreak, and this is in 2006. A few years later, this is the case. So it absolutely taken North America by storm. It swept across all the states in America, well, a lot of them anyway, 40 odd of them. And actually, interestingly, before it moved into the middle of America, it had actually jumped over towards Washington. So as you can see, those areas just south of Vancouver there. And we think that was actually a caver who took it over to the other side of the country. So the cavers a lot of them aren't disinfecting their equipment and their clothes, and are actually spreading the fungal spores around the caves. But obviously bats are also passing it between each other now as well. So yeah, pretty sad stuff. And they think millions and millions and millions of bats have died across North America. And it has up to 100% mortality rate. So some of the colonies are completely wiped out. Really sad. So where did this fungus come from, and how does it kill the bats? So that's a electron micrograph image of the fungus on the left. And the fungus has come from Europe. So essentially humans have brought it over to North America. And yeah, it actually affects bats in Europe as well. So it's a bit like the common cold though. So bats in Europe have co-evolved with this fungus, so it doesn't really affect them. They have a high tolerance and resistance to this fungus. But obviously it's a novel pathogen in North America. So we've brought it over to North America. Inadvertently, the bats have acquired it, and they have not co-evolved this evolved resistance or tolerance to the fungus. And obviously it's wiping them out by the millions. So really sad stuff. And we think it actually might have evolved from a plant fungus pathogen as well, thousands of years ago. In my opinion, we should care because of their intrinsic value. So I think other organisms have an intrinsic value other than just an instrumental value. So I think biodiversity has an intrinsic value as well. But biodiversity also has instrumental value. So we should care as well from the bat's perspective because they're instrumental value too. And these photographs might illustrate my point or give an indication of what I'm going to say. So essentially, this is a fascinating kind of interconnected phenomenon here. So we've essentially brought over a fungus that's killed bats in North America. Because we've wiped out the bats with this fungus, bats actually play a key role in controlling invertebrate species. So some ecologists say that a single microbat can mop up up to 3,000 invertebrates in a single night. And some of these invertebrates are known as agricultural, so-called pests. So without the bats flying around, there's nothing natural in the ecosystem to control these so-called pests. So what happened is no bats, no natural biological control, and so farmers had turned to increasing the use of pesticides to control the invertebrates chewing on their crops. And so the pesticides increased by something like 30 or 40% around this time of this outbreak. And there's a really fascinating study by Ethel Frank, who showed that the decrease in the bat population led to an increase in insecticide use, which has been strongly correlated to an increase in infant mortality. So by 8%, I think it was as well. So absolutely shocking stuff, but it kind of beautifully illustrates the interconnectedness of it, why we should, from an instrumental perspective, why we should be protecting biodiversity. There are several studies now that show links between increased pesticide use and infant mortality and congenital malformations and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, pretty depressing again. So that's the third part of the book, all focus on wildlife diseases, but also, how it could potentially affect humans as well. And then the fourth part of the book, this is the fourth and final part of the book, it's all about solutions and rays of hope. Quite a few chapters in here, I think 6 or 7. So this is all about it comes back to this kind of one health concept, how human health, non-human animal health, and environmental health are all interconnected. So we need to look after our environment to look after ourselves. This guy here, I took this photo from the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. This is a grey-headed flying fox. So there's basically a population, something like 50,000 bats that have moved to Adelaide. So they're not locally native. They've moved there from the east coast of Australia. They've moved there because we've chopped down all their forests. So they don't have a food resource or roosting site. So they had to move on and find somewhere else to live. So they've moved to Adelaide. And you don't have to read this. It's just a LinkedIn post that I put on the other week, sorry. But I'll just summarize it. So protecting habitat, so their roosting and feeding sites and connectivity habitats, is imperative because when their habitat is under threat, they are more likely to come into contact with humans as they search for better places to live and feed, as they have done in Adelaide now. And when their habitat is under threat, they are also more likely to be stressed. And this is a key point, as I made earlier. So stress alters the balance between the host and the virus, and this imbalance can lead to an increase in viral replication and shedding. And shedding is the process by which viruses are released from an infected host into the environment, allowing the virus to spread to others. And so this diagram on the right, this figure on the right, was taken from Rainer Plowright's paper back last year. And the top part basically illustrates, you see the blue kind of belt at the top. This shows that there is normally a buffer in terms of the resources available for bats in normal conditions when ecosystems are healthy. So the total energy available far exceeds the total energy needed of the bats. So from energy, we're talking about, the fruiting trees, for instance. In B and C, so the panels below, when we start to degrade ecosystems and chop down these trees that provide energy for the bats, this buffer is significantly reduced to the point that when it's really degraded, when we're chopping down all the trees, the energy available is far less than the energy needed for the bats. And this causes what we call allostatic overload in the bats, essentially kind of chronic buildup of stress in the bats, which weakens their immune system. They're more likely to shed viruses into the environment. This just illustrates how, healthy bat habitat means healthy bats, means healthy humans. And this is an article I published in the Lancet Planetary Health a few years ago. Ecosystem restoration is integral to humanity's recovery from COVID-19. And so we talk about this kind of issue of conserving and restoring habitats, providing bats as an example, but also some of the social value as well of restoration. So you have these things called green prescriptions as well. So you can go to a doctor and they can prescribe you kind of systematic time spent engaging with nature, engaging all the senses, and it has various well-being benefits. As I mentioned, this is kind of the overview of the chapters in this fourth part of the book. So One Health and Healing Nature. So I talk much more about this One Health triad, and then green prescriptions, as I just mentioned. So part of my PhD a few years ago was actually on green prescriptions, in addition to various microbiome sciencey stuff. Black market biodiversity. So this is the illegal wildlife trade and how we can potentially, or how and why we need to do something about it, because it's spreading diseases across the world in wildlife, but also in humans. Sowing the seeds of change. This is the idea that we really need a revolution in our food systems. So there's lots of people working on really cool things to try and make that happen. But the unsustainable, highly industrialized, high intensive, agricultural system at the moment is one of the key drivers of disease outbreaks and ecosystem degradation. Vaccinations for humans. So some people are against vaccinations, but they have saved countless lives in humans, and scientists are developing them, have been developing them for wildlife as well. So those bats I mentioned earlier who had white nose syndrome, they've been on trials where they've actually given the bats an inoculation to see if they can boost their immune system. They've also tried giving bats probiotics as well, much like we would take probiotics for our guts, and they've had actually some decent success. And then the final chapter is staying ahead of the curve. This is all talking about all the people that work behind the scenes in pandemics that we don't ever hear about, and all the different technology that's used to help us surveil different diseases and stay ahead of the curve. So this is a really important part of the book. So I've spoken about kind of the One Health concept and some of these disease agents. I do emphasize in the book as well, though, as most of my work involves microbes, but from a beneficial perspective. So, the part of the One Health triad is recognizing that most of the microbes out there in the environment are actually really important for our health. So the bacteria, viruses, etc. So what about our invisible friends? If you've been to my talk before, you might have seen a couple of these slides, but who considers themselves to be independent? So hopefully a few of you might do. But humans are literally incapable of doing anything by themselves. So basically we all depend on microbial communities of bacteria, fungi, viruses, protozoa, etc., that live inside and on our bodies in the billions and billions. So we have distinct microbial communities in our skin, in our airways, in our guts, etc. And they all have genes that encode for various functions that keep our body healthy and thriving. And so we all depend on the 100 trillion microbes that currently reside inside and on our bodies at any given moment. And this actually refers to bacteria. So everybody sat here watching this right now has around 380 trillion viruses inside their body at any given moment. And these are known as phage viruses, but they play a really important role in keeping some bacteria in check, essentially. So they maintain the biological equilibrium in our walking ecosystems. So those viruses that you're kind of full of, many of them are doing good things. So let's meet a few of these. So we have all sorts of microbes in different shapes and sizes. Some of these you probably have on your bodies, inside your body, maybe not the top right, which is a tardigrade, which lives in mosses and lichens. And then the one in the middle also you probably don't have in your body. It's called a geobacter bacterium. So this lives typically deep down in the mud in anaerobic conditions, so where there's not much oxygen, and it can generate its own electricity through these little protein nanowires that come off its body. But the rest of them you probably have living inside you and on you in the thousands and thousands and thousands. A few snappy statistics about the human microbiome. So you have around 1.3 times more microbes than human cells in your body. The genes in your microbiome outnumber your own genes by about 150 to 1. And if you were able to extract all of the microbes from just one person's body, one person's gut, and line them up in a row, they'd be able to circle the Earth 2.5 times. So mind-blowing numbers. Now, a Finnish immunologist says we are protected by 2 nested layers of biodiversity, so quite a nice phrase to use. The microorganisms of the outer layer in the soil, the waters, the plants and the animals, and the microbes of the inner layer. So we're talking about the human gut, the skin and the airways. Now, the microbes of this inner layer are colonized by the microbes from the outer layer, so in our environment and our food, etc. So we are these walking, talking ecosystems of life. Okay, so you're a host. You cannot view yourself as an individual from this point onwards. You have to view yourself as a kind of walking, talking ecosystem or a community of life. You're a host with trillions of microbes that work symbiotically to form a functioning walking, talking system. And so everybody here is emitting 1 million biological particles from their bodies every single hour, but you're also ingesting and inhaling millions of these particles and microbes, etc., every single day. My friend Professor Graham Rook from London, he's also an immunologist, quite a famous one, and he likens the immune system at birth to a computer system. So he says at birth, the human immune system already has in place the hardware, which is analogous to the cellular structures of our immune system. We also have the software as well. This is analogous to the genes that encode for proteins that allow our immune system to function. But the one thing we lack at birth, or our immune system lacks, is data. And so the data Graham Rook's referring to is all of the microorganisms from the environment. So we need to be exposed to as many different species as possible from a young age in order to train and regulate our immune system. So there are three key reasons. One is because we need to be exposed to lots of different species to train what's called our adaptive immune system. And this basically means that we can build up a tiny army of memory cells. So we remember what we're exposed to, and this allows us to mount a much more efficient immune response in the future. So we have this kind of tiny armies of memory cells that remember these pathogens or other different biogenic compounds in the environment. And the second reason is what's called the old friends hypothesis. So this is the idea that we've co-evolved with lots of different certain specific species of microbes in the environment that have played a key role in shaping and regulating what's called our innate immune system. Now, this is also known as non-specific immunity. So basically, it means that the innate immune system, without proper regulation by these old friends microorganisms from the environment, so without this regulation, the innate immune system will essentially attack absolutely anything that tries to enter the body. So this can include ordinarily innocuous stuff like pollen and dust and animal hair, but also the own body cells, which can manifest as an autoimmune disorder. So we need to be regulated by these old friend microorganisms through something called pattern recognition receptors. Now, the third reason we need to have a diverse microbiome in and on our bodies is what's called in ecology the competitive exclusion principle. Now, this is just the idea that if we have a very diverse microbiome, so lots of different species that are well adapted and long living in our ecosystem, they're much more likely to outcompete and boot out any opportunistic pathogens that try and invade and take over the body. Okay, so it's like having a very diverse, well-established ecosystem that's very resilient. This is another illustration that we are basically a bunch of microbes. So there's three reasons: adaptive immunity, the innate immunity, so there's old friends microbes, and then this kind of competitive exclusion principle, this kind of sorry, no room at the inn for you. But actually a recent study suggests that it's more like no room at the dining table. So microbiome diversity protects against pathogens by nutrient blocking. So as you can see in this image here, the higher the microbiome diversity, it correlates to a higher colonization resistance. So essentially the microbes that are well established in your body are consuming all the nutrients that would otherwise be available for pathogens. So that's a really important reason why eating lots of diverse foods, fruit and vegetables, etc., provides those prebiotics for your gut microbiome, thereby increasing the diversity and their colonization resistance. So with this walking, talking ecosystem constantly falling apart, but constantly rebuilding ourselves as well, and in constant interaction with our environments. And this is why the quality of our surrounding environment, our living environment, is a key determinant of our health. So we have the biodiversity and old friends hypothesis, the idea that we've moved away from our more ancestral biodiverse ecosystems into more urbanized, highly, well, sometimes sterilized environments, but mechanized, urbanized environments, essentially shutting nature out of our lives and shutting biodiversity out of our lives. And this is leading to a huge problem. So we're seeing these two global megatrends in the world. One is a decrease in biodiversity, so a decline in biodiversity. And at the same time, we're seeing this huge increase in immune disorders. So a rise in immune disorders, which is related to a decline in biodiversity, because we're not exposed to those microbes that we've co-evolved with. And this essentially leads to a higher risk of inflammatory diseases in our bodies. So how do we know biodiversity loss affects the human microbiome? Well, there are various kinds of studies that we can do. So population studies and intervention studies, all sorts of different ones, and lab-based studies. So this one's a population level study in America comparing the Amish people and the Hutterite people. So these are two very similar kind of groups of people genetically and geographically, where they come from and various other factors. The key thing that differs between these populations is their farming practices. So the Amish still practice quite hands-on traditional farming practices. So they're, in touch with the biodiversity, with the soil, the microbes, the animals, the plants. And the Hutterites have moved to more modernized chemical and mechanized based farming practices. So they're less in touch with the biodiversity around them. And what the researchers have found is that the immune disorders in these two populations are very different. So the Hutterites have a much higher prevalence of things like asthma and other allergies than the Amish people. And they've linked this to the microbiome. So they've looked at the Amish house dust microbiome, so the microbes that come from the environment and settle in the house of both the Amish and the Hutterite people, and their fecal microbiomes as well. So they've taken their stool and analysed their microbiomes. And they've inoculated them into germ-free mice, which is not a very nice thing to do, obviously. But germ-free mice are essentially born without germs, so that you know whatever you put inside them is the thing that's having the effect. And so these microbes from the Amish people were protective against immune disorders. And the Hutterites' microbiome was actually implicated in the onset of immune disorders. So pretty interesting stuff. Now, I mentioned intervention studies, so this is quite a nice one now from Finland. So these are kind of leading the way in this biodiversity intervention space. So they essentially identified a load of schoolyards that were quite desolate, so they didn't have much nature in them. And they kept 50% of these schoolyards as that kind of desolate, natureless kind of sites. And then the other 50% they brought in, so they imported local forest floor materials, things like leaf litter and soils and various plants and things, and they allowed the kids to play in them for 27 days. And what they found is that in the intervention site, so where they brought in biodiversity, the skin and the gut microbiome of the children had significantly increased in diversity, so it kind of went through the roof. And they also took blood and saliva samples and showed that the immune regulation in the children in the intervention sites had also significantly improved. And this kind of lasted for a year as well. So they did a longitudinal study, and it had this dual effect. So the microbiome diversity increased in the children, but it also reduced the relative abundance of certain pathogens in the skin of the children as well. So pretty interesting, but it just illustrates that, you know, we can do something about it. We're shutting nature out of our lives, but when we start bringing it back into our lives, then we start to see those positive effects on our bodies and our immune systems. These are a few studies that I did during my PhD, just to show that we can also design our urban environments to be more conducive to promoting health. So if we increase the vegetation complexity, so different plants and trees in our urban environments, this correlates with an increase in the diversity of microbes in the aerobiome. So this is the air, the microbes that live in the air that we're exposed to all of the time. And this generally is seen as a good thing. So we need to be exposed to more species of microbes. And it also has this effect of reducing the relative abundance of certain pathogens in the ecosystem as well. So this just shows that, you know, we can do something about it. A quick note on phytoncides. So these are these chemicals that are emitted by plants or trees, and they are volatile organic compounds that have been shown to be very, very beneficial for our health and well-being for various reasons. The image on the right shows that, you know, they've been shown to promote proper immune function through NK or natural killer cell activity. And what happens is it increases the production of this enzyme, various enzymes. One of them is called perforin, and it's called perforin because it literally perforates holes in tumor cells. So it kind of punches holes in cells that we don't need in our body. And these chemicals in the air, again, they've been linked to reduced inflammation in the body, reduced stress hormones, reduced blood pressure, increased positive affect, so positive emotions. And also they may improve sleep as well. So, you know, going for a forest walk, forest bathing, and being bathed, you know, bathing in these kind of chemicals that are floating around in the air can have all these kind of benefits on our body and may improve our sleep. So this last one was done in an animal study, an animal model, rodent, and it showed that these chemicals actually interact with what's called the gamma-aminobutyric acid pathway in the body. And this is a neurotransmitter that's essentially, it regulates excitation in the brain. So that's pretty interesting stuff. So this is, you know, more than microbes floating around in the air that are actually beneficial for us. But obviously we've got to restore and protect nature in order to have these exposures. And this is just to say that spending time in natural environments is a truly multi-sensory experience. So it's not all just about what you're exposed to and how that can potentially colonize your body. So the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, the touch of various things in nature. We should all be trying really meaningfully hard to kind of engage all of the senses because it can have various benefits. And, simply looking at something pleasing, these diverse fractal patterns and beautiful, diverse flowers and plants and things can have a real biochemical effect in our bodies. For instance, it interacts with the brain and which secretes a chemical called acetylcholine from the vagus nerve. And this acetylcholine can essentially hook onto these receptors in our heart and slow down our heart rate. And this is simply by looking at something that we find pleasing. So that's pretty cool. And this is to say that the multisensory effect of spending time in nature could also shape our gut microbiome indirectly through stress regulation pathways. So we could potentially be colonized by microbes, but in adulthood, I think it's more likely that the stress regulation pathways are kind of regulating our gut microbiome indirectly. I can talk more about that afterwards. So this is just to say that restoring natural environments restores their salutogenic potential, or salutogenic just means their health promoting potential. So you can think of salutogen as the opposite of pathogen. And this makes us and our environments more resilient to pandemic threats. And I just want to leave you again with this nice One Health triad. So the idea that protecting our natural environments is great for biodiversity, but it's also a public health intervention. So we should also be viewing protecting biodiversity and nature around us as a public health intervention, and really push and lobby the government and try and spread awareness and spread the word that it's really important for nature, but it's also good for our health. And you can find more about me at these links here, and I've published other books as well, so feel free to dive into those, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jake. That was pretty amazing, putting some science behind what we do. So I'm going to throw over to people to raise a hand to ask some questions.
Thanks.
Just check if there's anyone. I think everyone's quite. Oh, then there's Nadine. Go ahead.
Yes, of course I have a question. Hey Jake, thanks so much for the talk. I connected with you on LinkedIn during the week.
Oh, nice to meet you.
Yeah, so firstly, I really appreciated your points about language and our tendency to shift blame to other species. So I love that language you had. I've always found the term zoonotic a perplexing term, as if the shift to humans is reaching some extraordinary goal, like you're playing Mario Brothers or something. So do you have any thoughts about that term? And do you think there are other parameters or outputs that we should be monitoring rather than when a pathogen reaches humans?
Yeah, good point. That's a really interesting question. But there's also another term called panzootic, which basically the other way around. I think it's the other way around. So when also an anyway, there's another term that basically describes the opposite effect of our pathogens ourselves jumping into wild animals. So that's one thing I think we should focus on as well. It's not all about pathogens coming from wildlife into humans. It's also us spreading them into nature. But yeah, I mean, just thinking more holistically about these things, I think we should be. I mean, the whole message of the book is protect and restore nature. So I think that's one of the things we should be focusing on the most. Yeah, I'm not sure about issues with the term zoonotic. It's an interesting point, though.
I guess my point
I mean,
was
the main focus that I have is really to Go ahead.
It's as if zoonotic is the only. It's as if getting to humans is the only thing that matters. Is my concern with it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I see what you mean, but do you mean from an ecological perspective, or more from like a social, like what we should really be thinking about?
From a planetary health point, really, like there are other things that we could be monitoring, and I wonder if you've got thoughts about what else we could be monitoring, like moving into mammals, or moving from birds to mammals, or moving from one other animal group to us, from a cold-blooded animal to a warm-blooded animal. I mean, these things are really well.
Yeah, super. So I mean, I probably talk about a lot of these things in the book. That the one thing that's really interesting in Australia is spreading things like coronaviruses between lizards. That's really interesting. And people from other countries have these kind of cartels that come to Australia, and they send them out in camper vans into the outback, and then they go and collect lots of reptile species up, and then package them up and send them across the world in these horrible discussed in kind of packages. And these things are spreading, things like coronaviruses around. So that's one thing, you know, focusing on those types of things. What else? Yeah, I mean, there's lots of flus going around that are jumping between different species that aren't related to humans, and habitat degradation is increasing the stress on things like wild birds, so they need to pit stop more in order to restore their immune system, their immune health. But increasing pit stops also means they're spreading diseases to places they weren't before. So we need to kind of monitor those sorts of things as well. Yeah, all sorts of different things we need to think of. It's such a complex space, but hopefully I try and simplify some of these things in the book. But yeah, I try and focus the book more on this One Health perspective rather than framing it just. And obviously, the title's called "The Nature of Pandemics." It's a bit of a hook, I suppose, but I'm not sure calling it One Health would be very appealing to people. But yeah, it is all about the One Health triad, really.
Yep.
Thanks. Happy to connect another time, though. My brain might be switching off right now, so happy to discuss more.
Okay, has anyone else got any questions? Just put a hand up. Let's see if there's any other questions. I think I'm seeing some lovely comments. Thank you so much for an interesting talk, thought-provoking. And I agree, thought-provoking. So I think you've got everybody thinking about it, what you've spoken about today, and how, I mean, we're obviously in the business of regeneration and restoring of nature. So it's something to think about when we're all out in the field putting those plants in. Yeah. So yeah, definitely. It's good for us, and it's good for what we're doing. It's always a feel-good thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, I've got Clive. Clive, would you like to go off mute and add a question?
No, I meant to do the clapping hand actually.
Oh, sorry. I saw it floating up there, and I thought, is that? Thanks, Clive. No, I think it was appreciated. Yeah, someone here, Anne, has said, thanks for the talk, dispelled some myths for me. And Philippa said, a fascinating talk. Everyone should hear it. Thank you. So it's great to see everyone's enjoyed tonight's talk. If there's no more extra questions, now's your chance. Otherwise, I think we'll sign off and give you a chance to sit down back and relax.
Thanks, everyone, for joining in. Yeah. Happy to connect if you want to send me an email or send me some questions, etc. But yeah,
and we recorded tonight as well. So
brilliant.
Yeah. So a big round of applause for Jake, and we'll sign off.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.